The spring. Eli Ferris turned 12. He started walking the orchard rows before sunrise with a notebook and a pencil stub, counting something nobody else in Rutherford County thought to count. Not blossoms, not branches, bees. He'd crouch at the base of a golden delicious tree in full bloom, watch a single flower cluster for 5 full minutes, and write down a number. Then he'd move to the next tree and do it again. By the time the sun cleared the ridge line, he'd covered maybe 6 trees out of the 14 acres his grandfather had planted, and the number in his notebook rarely climbed past 2 or 3 visits per cluster per hour. He didn't tell his father what he was doing. He didn't tell anyone. He just kept walking the rows with his notebook, and when neighbors driving past on Persimmon Ridge Road saw a boy standing motionless in a sea of white blossoms, staring at nothing they could identify, they slowed down, shook their heads, and drove on, chuckling. Then, in March, 3 weeks before bloom, he asked his father if he could order 200 bees. Not a hive. Not a package of honeybees like the kind the county rented out every spring. 200 individual bees, mailed to the house in a small insulated box, kept in the refrigerator between the milk and the pickle jars. His father laughed so hard he had to sit down on the porch step. Everyone laughed. By June, nobody in Rutherford County was laughing anymore. If stories about patience, family, and the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself move you, subscribe and join us every week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Persimmon Ridge sits in the western foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where Rutherford County's red clay gives way to rockier ground, and the air stays cool even when the valleys below are baking. The Ferris orchard had been there since Eli's grandfather, a quiet man named Otis Ferris, planted the first rows of apple trees in the years after he came home from Korea. 14 acres of Golden Delicious, Stayman Winesap, and Arkansas Black laid out on terraced slopes that caught the morning sun and drained well after hard rain. Otis had died 6 years before this story starts, but the orchard had passed to Eli's father, Dale, who worked it with the same stubborn devotion, though increasingly with the same stubborn confusion, because something had been going wrong for a long time, and nobody could quite say what. Dale Ferris was a careful man, not given to complaint, but every year for the past 4 years, the trees had bloomed as thick and white as ever. A blizzard of blossoms every April that made tourists stop their cars on the Ridge Road to take pictures. And every year, the fruit set had gotten thinner. Where a healthy bloom should have produced apples on 60 or 70% of the flower clusters, the Ferris orchard had been managing something closer to 20. Whole branches bloomed gorgeously and then dropped their flowers to the ground without a single apple forming. Dale blamed a late frost one year, an early heat spell the next, a wet spring after that. He rotated through explanations the way a man rotates through keys on a ring, trying each one, hoping it would finally fit the lock. Eli's mother, Corinne, ran the roadside stand where they sold apples, cider, and preserves every fall, and she was the one who felt the shrinking harvest most directly, because there was less to sell every October than there had been the October before. Eli's older brother, Tucker, 16, and mostly interested in his truck and his girlfriend in Forest City, thought the whole orchard business was a slow-motion disaster that he intended to escape the moment he graduated. Eli's younger sister, Wren, 9 years old and endlessly curious, thought whatever Eli was doing looked more interesting than anything happening at school, and she followed him through the rows most mornings, handing him things before he asked for them. And then there was Vesta, Eli's grandmother, Otis's widow, 83 years old and sharp as a tack, who lived in the converted sunroom at the back of the farmhouse and kept a shelf of old beekeeping journals that had belonged to her husband. Otis had kept honeybees for almost 30 years, up until the mid-2000s, when colony losses got so bad and so mysterious that he lost 4 hives in a single winter and simply stopped trying. He'd sold his equipment, given away his smoker, and never mentioned bees again. Though Vesta had kept his journals, 3 spiral-bound notebooks filled with a beekeeper's small, careful handwriting, recording hive weights and bloom dates and weather notes going back to 1979. She read them the way some people read old letters, not for the information anymore, but for the company of the person who wrote them. It was Vesta who first noticed that Eli was watching the orchard differently than his siblings ever had. Not looking at the apples. Not looking at the trees at all, really. Looking at the space just above the blossoms, the air itself, the way something moves through it or doesn't. The spring Eli turned 11. The year before this story, the county extension agent, a patient man named Roy Callahan, had come out twice to look at the fruit set problem, the same way he'd come out to plenty of orchards along the ridge that year, because the Ferris place wasn't the only one struggling. Roy had a working theory, and it wasn't wrong exactly, just incomplete. He pointed to the fence rows that used to run wild with blackberry, wild plum, and clover, and how most of them along Persimmon Ridge Road had been mowed flat and sprayed clean over the past decade so the hayfields could be tidier and the road crews could see further around the curves. He pointed to a stretch of land 2 farms over that had gone into a contract with a regional produce operation that sprayed a broad-spectrum insecticide during bloom windows, following label directions to the letter, technically legal, timed for a different crop, but drifting far enough on a breezy day to do damage nobody could prove and nobody wanted to accuse anybody of. And he pointed to the simple fact that wild bee populations everywhere had been declining for years, quietly, underneath the notice of most people, because nobody keeps a census of insects nobody thinks to count. Roy's advice was reasonable, and it was also, in practical terms, almost useless to a family who couldn't control their neighbor's spray schedule or replant a decade of mowed fence row overnight. Rent more honeybee hives for Bloom Week, he said. Rent them earlier. Space them more evenly through the orchard instead of clustering them at the entrance where the delivery truck could park easiest. Dale did all of that the following spring, at real expense, and the fruit set ticked up only slightly, not nearly enough. Eli listened to every word Roy Callahan said, both visits, standing at the edge of the adults' conversation with his arms crossed the way boys that age stand when they're trying to look older than they are. And he asked Roy a question that made the extension agent go quiet for a moment. "The honeybees you rent," Eli said. "What if it's too cold when they get here?" Roy explained that honeybees don't fly much below about 55 degrees, and that a rented hive dropped off during a cold snap in early April might sit there for days doing almost nothing while the bloom passed overhead. Wasted. "So the flowers open on the tree's schedule," Eli said slowly, working it out loud. "But the bees only work on the weather's schedule. And in April up here, those aren't the same schedule most years." Roy said that was about the size of it, and that there wasn't a lot anybody could do about weather. That was in April. By the following winter, Eli had started reading his grandmother's journals. Here is what Eli found, buried in Otis's careful handwriting from a stretch of years in the early 1980s, before honeybee rental became the standard practice everybody defaulted to. Otis had written several entries about something called orchard mason bees, sometimes called blue orchard bees, a native species entirely separate from honeybees, solitary rather than colonial, meaning each female builds and provisions her own nest rather than living in a hive with a queen. Otis had never kept them himself, but he'd clearly corresponded with somebody who did, because the journal included a hand-copied page of notes on their biology, and Eli read that page so many times over the winter that the paper started to soften at the fold. Mason bees, the notes explained, emerge from their cocoons in early spring at temperatures far lower than honeybees require, sometimes flying comfortably at 45 degrees, which meant they were active during exactly the cold, unreliable weeks when apple bloom in the mountains tends to happen, and honeybees tend to sit inside their hives doing nothing. They didn't produce honey, and they didn't sting except under extreme provocation, since they had no hive or queen to defend. And because of how they collect pollen, carrying it dry and loose on the underside of their abdomen rather than packing it wet into leg baskets the way honeybees do, they were remarkably inefficient at holding on to it, which sounds like a flaw until you understand what it means for a flower. A mason bee drops pollen constantly as she moves from bloom to bloom, brushing it against the next flower's stigma almost by accident, dozens of times an hour. Because of this, the old note explained, a single female orchard mason bee could pollinate roughly the same number of blossoms in a day that it might take 60 to 100 honeybees to cover. Eli did the math himself, sitting at Vesta's kitchen table with her old journals spread out and a calculator borrowed from his sister's homework folder. 200 mason bees, at even a conservative fraction of that ratio, could theoretically do pollination work equivalent to several thousand honeybees, working during exactly the cold snaps when the rented hives sat idle in their boxes at the orchard entrance. He didn't have a hive to rent, and he didn't have the money for one anyway. What he had was a grandmother's old notebook, a retired neighbor 2 farms over who used to run a bee removal business, and a plan that nobody else in the county had thought through the way he had, because nobody else had spent an entire spring standing motionless in the blossoms counting. The retired neighbor was a man named Emmett Loudon, 74 years old, who had spent 30 years pulling honeybee colonies out of barn walls and chimneys and abandoned sheds all over 3 counties before his knees gave out, and he sold the business. Emmett still had a shed full of old equipment nobody had bought from him, including a stack of pre-drilled wooden nesting blocks and paper straw liners he'd used years earlier on a side project raising mason bees for a nursery client who wanted better pollination on greenhouse blueberries. Eli rode his bike to Emmett's place 3 times that winter before Emmett finally understood what the boy was actually asking for, which wasn't equipment for sale, but a source population. Emmett had an old hollow chestnut snag on the back edge of his property, a dead tree still standing from before the blight, riddled with insect holes, and he mentioned almost as an afterthought that every spring a healthy population of wild mason bees emerged from cavities in that snag and worked his own struggling plum trees for free. Nobody had ever harvested from it. Nobody had ever needed to. Emmett and Eli spent 2 Saturdays that February carefully extracting cocoons from the accessible holes in the old snag, using a technique Emmett half remembered and Eli filled in the rest of from a handful of agricultural extension bulletins he printed at the county library, since none of Otis's old notes covered the harvesting process itself. They candled each cocoon against a small flashlight to check for a healthy dark pupa inside rather than a parasitized or dead one, discarding the ones that looked wrong. By the end of the second Saturday, they had 211 viable cocoons, which Eli washed gently in a very dilute bleach solution to knock down mold spores, a step he'd read about, and Emmett confirmed from memory, then stored in a ventilated container in the crisper drawer of the Ferris family refrigerator, between the milk and the pickle jars, at a steady temperature just above freezing. This was, Eli had learned, the way to hold mason bee cocoons in a kind of extended winter sleep, so they wouldn't emerge before the orchard was ready for them. He could control, with a refrigerator, the one variable that honeybee rental could never control: timing. His father found out about the cocoons in the crisper drawer entirely by accident, reaching in for the milk one Tuesday morning, And that was the conversation that ended with Dale laughing so hard on the porch step that Corinne came out to check on him. 200 bees. Mail-order bees, though of course they weren't mail-order at all. They'd come out of a dead tree on Emmett Loudon's property. But Dale didn't know that yet, and the image of his 12-year-old son ordering 200 individual insects like they were seed packets struck him as the funniest thing he'd heard in a year. He wasn't cruel about it. He just couldn't quite picture how 200 bees, when the orchard problem had defeated a county extension agent and a season of rented hives, were going to change anything. What Eli built that spring was not elegant. It started as a plan for a single nesting station near the orchard's upper edge and grew, through 2 failures, into something closer to what an actual practiced beekeeper might have built on the first try. Except Eli had to earn every piece of that knowledge the hard way, in real time, with real consequences. The first attempt went up in mid-March, 3 weeks ahead of expected bloom. Eli built a simple wooden box from scrap lumber his father had left over from a fence repair, filled it with paper drinking straws cut to length as temporary nesting tunnels, since he hadn't yet gotten Emmett's pre-drilled blocks moved over, and mounted the whole thing on a post at the orchard's sunniest corner, facing due south, because he'd read that mason bees like warmth to get moving in the morning. He brought the cocoons out of the refrigerator, let them acclimate slowly over 2 days on the back porch out of direct sun, and then placed them in a small mesh release box at the base of the nesting station and waited. They emerged almost immediately, and far too fast. The south-facing post, catching full sun from mid-morning on, ran warm enough that the whole population woke and took flight within about 36 hours, nearly 2 weeks before the earliest apple blossoms had opened. Eli stood in the orchard on a bright, blossomless March afternoon and watched 200 confused bees fly out over bare branches with nothing to forage on, scattering into the woods and fence rows looking for whatever early-season flowers they could find instead, most of which weren't apples. He'd made, he realized, walking back to the house that evening, the same mistake as the honeybee rental, just in the opposite direction. Instead of arriving too late for the bloom because of cold weather, he'd released them too early because of too much sun. Vesta, sitting at her kitchen table with the journals, didn't say, "I told you so," because there was nothing in the journals that would have told him so. This was Eli's own miscalculation, and she let him sit with it for a night before she asked him, gently, what he thought he'd do differently. The second attempt, he moved the nesting station to the north side of the equipment shed, cooler, shadier, closer to the actual bloom line, and he added a length of shade cloth over the release box to slow the warming further. This time he waited to bring the cocoons out of the refrigerator until the earliest apple buds had cracked open into pink, the stage just before full bloom that Roy Callahan had taught him to watch for during one of the extension visits. The bees stayed dormant in the shade far longer than he expected, cool and sluggish, and Eli started to worry he'd overcorrected entirely, that he'd built a box so cold nothing would emerge before the bloom finished and dropped. Then a hard spring rain moved through for 2 straight days, and the improvised roof he'd nailed onto the nesting box, a single flat board without any pitch to shed water, let rain seep straight down through the gaps between straws. He found a dozen cocoons floating in standing water at the bottom of the box the morning after the storm broke. He lost close to 30 bees to that flooding before he understood what had happened, and he spent that whole afternoon rebuilding the roof with a proper slope and an overhang, the kind of correction that feels obvious after the fact and invisible before it. The third attempt he built with Emmett's help, using the pre-drilled wooden nesting blocks instead of paper straws, mounted under the actual eave of the orchard equipment shed itself, protected fully from rain, facing southeast so it caught gentle early morning sun without cooking through the afternoon, and set at a slight downward tilt on Emmett's insistence, which kept any moisture that did get in from pooling at the back of each tunnel. He added a shallow tray of moistened clay soil nearby, since mason bees need mud to seal each finished nest cell, and there wasn't a natural clay source close enough to the shed. He released the remaining cocoons in the first week of April, right at pink bud stage, on a mild, still morning with no rain in the forecast. This time, it worked. Dale noticed before anyone told him to look. He was walking the upper rows, checking irrigation lines on a Saturday morning in mid-April, deep into bloom, and he stopped between two golden delicious trees because something sounded different. Not louder exactly, busier. He stood still and watched small, dark bees, smaller than honeybees, moving fast and low between blossoms, disappearing into the flower centers and backing out dusted heavily with pollen, then darting to the very next bloom instead of the flight patterns he was used to seeing from the rented hives, which tended to work a single branch thoroughly before moving on. These bees seemed to be everywhere at once, covering ground honeybees would have taken all morning to cover. He found Eli at the nesting station near the equipment shed, refilling the clay tray with a garden trowel. "How many of these are actually working the trees?" Dale asked, "versus just flying around?" Eli told him he'd been counting since sunrise, the same way he'd counted the year before, and the number of visits per flower cluster per hour had more than tripled compared to any morning he'd logged the previous spring. Dale was quiet for a long moment, the way a man goes quiet when a number rearranges something he thought he understood. "You want to build more of these," he finally said, "for next year?" By late May, with the bloom long finished and the truth of it sitting green and swelling on the branches, the difference was impossible to argue with. Fruit set across the upper block, the block nearest the Mason Bee Station, was running close to 60% of flower clusters carrying developing apples, compared to the low 20s the orchard had settled into over the previous 4 years. The lower block, further from the nesting station and still relying mainly on the rented honeybee hives, showed only modest improvement. It was, in effect, a controlled experiment nobody had set out to design, written across 14 acres in the plainest possible language: leaves and branches and the weight of fruit. Roy Callahan came back out in June, not for a routine visit this time, but because Dale had called him specifically, and he walked the orchard with Eli asking careful questions, the posture of a professional adjusting a picture he thought he already had in focus. He'd read about orchard mason bees in extension literature for years, he admitted, filed away as one tool among many, but he'd never seen a family farm build a working population from scratch using nothing but a dead tree, a retired neighbor's memory, and an old beekeeping journal. He asked if he could bring a graduate student from North Carolina State's entomology program out in the fall to document the nesting blocks, and, if the Ferris family was willing, help Eli expand the program properly the following spring with additional nest sites spaced through the lower block. A reporter from the Rutherford County paper came out not long after that, drawn by something Roy had mentioned at a county extension meeting, and the story that ran that August carried a photograph of Eli standing at the nesting station with a nesting block in his hands, cocoons visible in the drilled holes, and a headline that used the word prodigy, which Eli found almost as uncomfortable as Delapuite, 4 counties over in Kentucky, would later find the word innovator when her own story ran. By harvest that October, word had traveled the length of Persimmon Ridge Road. The neighbors who had slowed their trucks that spring to watch a boy stand motionless in the blossoms, the ones who'd heard through Dale's own laughing retelling about the 200 mail-order bees in the refrigerator, drove out to see the orchard for themselves before the last of the apples came off the trees. They came expecting to be polite about whatever they found. What they found instead was an upper block so heavy with fruit that Dale had needed to prop up 3 separate limbs with wooden braces to keep them from splitting under the weight, something that hadn't happened on this farm in longer than anyone could remember. One of the visiting farmers, a man who ran 40 acres of Stamen apples on the far side of the ridge and who had laughed the hardest back in March, walked the rows without saying much of anything, then reached up and pulled down a golden delicious, turned it over in his hand, and looked for a long moment at the boy standing at the edge of the row with dirt on his boots and a bee box tucked under one arm. "What did you actually do?" the man finally asked. "Besides the bees themselves?" Eli walked him through it the way he'd walked Roy Callahan through it in June. The timing mostly. Cold hardy bees released at exactly the moment the buds cracked open, sheltered from both the sun that would wake them too early and the rain that would drown them before they got the chance to work, provisioned with the mud they needed to finish each nest, positioned close enough to the bloom that not 1 minute of a short, unreliable mountain spring got wasted. Waiting on weather nobody could control. It wasn't complicated once you saw it laid out. It had simply required someone to watch closely enough, for long enough, to notice what the problem actually was, instead of settling for the explanation that happened to be easiest to blame. The laughter that had followed Eli around the county since March was gone by October, replaced by something slower to arrive and considerably more durable. 3 separate neighboring farms asked before the season ended whether Eli and Emmett would help them identify wild mason bee populations on their own properties the following winter, and whether Eli would walk them through building nesting stations of their own before the next bloom came around. The naturalist and writer Rachel Carson once put it plainly, "In nature, nothing exists alone." Eli Ferris didn't set out that spring to prove a scientific principle. He set out to solve one very specific, very local problem: a family orchard losing fruit year after year to a cause nobody in the county had fully named. But the solution he found only worked because he understood, in a way most of the adults around him hadn't quite gotten around to, that the apple blossom, the wild bee, the dead chestnut snag on a neighbor's back property line, the mowed fence row, the cold mountain morning, and the careful, patient boy standing still in the middle of it all watching were never separate problems and separate facts to begin with. They were one system, and once you saw the whole of it, the 200 bees weren't a punchline anymore. They were the answer that had been sitting in an old dead tree the whole time, waiting for somebody to look closely enough to notice it. Eli is 13 now. He and the graduate student from North Carolina State spent last fall mapping 4 more wild mason bee source sites across 3 neighboring farms, and this spring the Ferris orchard ran nesting stations through both the upper and lower blocks for the first time. Vesta still keeps Otis's journals on the kitchen table, though there's a 4th notebook now, this one in Eli's own handwriting, and she reads his entries the same careful way she reads her husband's. Emmett Luton, knees and all, still walks out to the old chestnut snag every February to help candle cocoons, and says he intends to keep doing it as long as his legs will carry him that far. Tucker still talks about leaving the orchard business behind the moment he graduates, though he was the one who ended up building 3 of the new nesting stations last fall, working alongside his younger brother without much comment either way. And the fruit set at the Ferris orchard, for the first time in 5 years, is no longer the thing anybody worries about come April. It's the bees they watch for now, the small dark ones that move too fast to really see clearly, working the cold mornings that used to be wasted, turning a blizzard of blossoms into something that actually stays on the tree. What lessons stayed with you from Eli's story? Drop it in the comments below. We read every one of them. Tell us where you're watching from. This community reaches further than you'd think. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe and join us for the next one.